Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Eric Ballantyne. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers Podcast, and we have a return guest. Her name is Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. She was on early on in the podcast, and we brought her back because she has a new book out called Nutrivore, and it's got some different concepts versus what we talked about last time on the podcast. So we brought her back. We're going to talk about this concept that she's talking about on her book, her podcast, or on other podcasts, and this new concept. So Dr. Sarah, welcome back to the Thyroid Answers Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing well.
So last time we had you on the podcast, we were talking about nutrition and there was other dietary strategies that were out there, but now you have a new book out there called the Nutrivore. What led to maybe some of the change in concept regarding dietary strategies and focusing on this new concept, Nutrivore?
So I think I've been a nutrient nerd, so to speak, for a very long time and very interested in the health implications of nutrient shortfalls. So not meeting our nutritional needs from our dietary choices and seeing both a need in sort of the wellness community at large for furthering our understanding of the importance of nutrients. There's 49 essential nutrients, and I think we tend to get very fixated on macronutrients, on calories, on potentially, inflammatory compounds, and we lose the forest for the trees. We tend to then not think so much about meeting our nutritional needs. And this has been something that I've been trying to figure out a way for a very long time to focus food choice within somebody's dietary preferences so that they're actually meeting their nutritional needs. Nutrivore is just the goal of getting all of the nutrients our bodies need from the foods we eat. It's a dietary philosophy rather than a dietary template. But my move from sort of restrictive mindset to Nutrivore as a core concept came out of actually researching the gut microbiome. So I spent 7 years working on a book. It's a project I stepped away from in 2020. But I kept getting faced with scientific studies showing me that a food was like just phenomenal for supporting either a keystone species or a higher microbial diversity in the gut microbiome. And they were foods that I was not eating, that I did not view positively. And that started to really open up my eyes to a more comprehensive way of looking at foods and understanding that just because a food has a compound in it that is potentially inflammatory, it doesn't mean the whole food is, right? So we might have inflammatory compounds in a food, but we can be compensated by a wealth of nutrients in those foods so that the overall effect can be anti-inflammatory. And so as I expanded my view of foods, it became very clear to me that I needed to walk away from my previous content and thought processes on foods to avoid and start building something that's very focused on what to add. So that's Nutrivore. It's not, I say there's no food you have to avoid, but there's also no food you have to eat. So it's a dietary philosophy where like the default mode is sort of an anti-diet implementation, but it also can be used as a diet modifier layered over top of other dietary templates to help focus food choices so that we're fixing those nutrient shortfalls that can dig even deeper health holes when we're trying to do diet changes to address specific health concerns.
So I'm a huge advocate of no diet and more of an advocate of whole food. I think 80% of the time we should be eating whole food, locally grown, organic if possible. Eat things like they came out of the ground, off the tree, of the plant out of the water, right? I think that as close to nature as we can eat something, probably the better off we are. And in the past, there's a lot of dietary religions, especially from a functional medicine and integrated medicine standpoint. Everybody has their religion, and this is the one thing. But I think the nice thing is that they all have a short-term benefit, I think. And I think you talk about this quite a bit. They all can have an impact, right? They can all create some change in health and gut biome, at least temporarily. But there's a drawback to being so devout in your religion that you don't see the downside to it. And I think you did a nice job kind of pointing out, like, hey, if you do AIP, there's some consequences. It could be beneficial, but there's consequences. If you go carnivore, maybe there's benefits, but there's challenges. And I think that's where we sometimes get stuck. So when I saw that you came out with the book, then I was like, all right, like this is really kind of more in line with what I try and get my patients to do, is like, look, you don't have to be perfect 100% of the time. Matter of fact, that's way too stressful. And you're going to eat some crap. But the body's got this amazing ability to heal and repair if we're just not if we're not 80% crap and we're more 15 to 20%, we can probably adapt and adjust. We're such amazing beings, but we have a tendency not to do that. We're either all in on something or we're all out, right? If you're a carnivore, there's no way you can eat plants. They're all toxic. They're all going to kill you. Really? Like, don't those plants provide something that's triggers an immune inflammatory response to make us more resilient in time? So I was happy to see it. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you back to kind of talk about what this is, especially in light of how dug in sometimes we are in functional medicine and integrated medicine. We tend to circle the wagons and shoot in instead of really putting the emphasis where it should be on maybe a highly processed world of food loaded with toxins and challenges. So let's keep, since we have limited, usually my podcasts go about a good hour and a half and we have limited time. Let's really talk about the concepts behind a Nutrivore. It's not diet, it's more a lifestyle. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say it's an approach to what I call sustainable nutrition, right? So it's really the knowledge base to support lifelong healthy eating patterns. So in that sense, yes, I would say more of a lifestyle. It's not designed to be a thing that you do for as long as you can until you can't do it anymore. So I think is sort of the problem with the sort of all or nothing dietary approaches that are how most dietary frameworks are sort of sold, right? You have to do it perfectly or it doesn't count. So very much exactly what you were saying, right? Like 80-20, right? Embracing some imperfection as a tool for sustainability, right? So looking at overall higher diet quality, what does that look like? And how do I adopt that in such a way that I'm enjoying the foods that I'm eating? I can afford it. It's not stressing how much time I have to prepare food. It's setting ourselves up in such a way that higher diet quality is something we can maintain over years and decades, right? So if the goal is, we always have short-term health goals that we want to achieve, but the goal of a long-term healthy eating pattern is to support long-term health, right? It is to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, right? Chronic kidney disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, right? All of these health conditions that eventually are not just expensive, but erode quality of life. In order to reduce our risk of those health problems, we need to be able to stick to a higher quality diet for the long term, right? It doesn't, if I can do however we want to define a perfect diet, I would argue there's no such thing. But let's say we can agree on what that would look like. If I can do that perfectly for a few months, that's great. And that might help me reach some short-term health goals. But it's not even gonna be a drop in the bucket in terms of those long-term health outcomes, right? Because what matters for those things is how I eat on average over years and decades. So doing something for a short period of time, even if that alleviates some symptoms, maybe I lose some weight, right? Maybe it clears up my skin, like whatever it is, the thing that I want now. But then if I go from that like I had to work so hard to stick to this thing, and then I achieved whatever my end goal was, or I just couldn't do it anymore because diets do get progressively harder to stick to because of the psychological impacts of restriction. Whatever that thing that like is I was on and now I'm off the diet bandwagon thing. However, whatever I land into, that has to be averaged into those few months of like perfect diet that I just did. And that is what is affecting my long-term health outcomes. So
Mhm.
instead of having perfect for as long as I possibly can hold on, and then whatever's on the other side of that yo-yo, the idea is embrace a little imperfection so that we're customizing for our own food preferences, right? Our flavor preferences, our budget, the time and energy we have to prepare food. We're setting ourselves up in such a way that the average, because we're not going on again, off again, the average is way higher than the
Mhm.
average would be of that perfect for a few months and then wherever I end up landing. And we look at, for me, it's dessert, right? That is my quality of life food. But whatever that thing is that like is the comfort food or the safe food for people with strong food aversions or the budget stretching food, right? Or the convenient food, whatever that just the thing that's pure joy, sort of incorporating that intentionally, provided we don't have like medical reasons for not eating that food, right? But embracing that as a tool for sustainability and then focusing on the additions, right? So like focusing on that 80%, but like make sure that 20% is there for the joy of it, right? Like because that 80% is going to easily meet our nutritional needs and give us all of those foods that can support long-term health outcomes.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about the socialization
Yeah.
of eating, even alcohol. I mean, people are like, so could I drink alcohol? Well, alcohol is a toxin. But if you're consuming it every day in, day out, and probably way too much, is it going to have a consequence on your health? Absolutely. Is the occasional cocktail during the week that you have with your girlfriends or your guy friends where you sit down and laugh and have good old belly laughs and enjoy some, maybe less healthy food? Could there possibly be some benefit to that? Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's something to that I think when you're living in this world, like I can't eat that, I can't eat that, and you're in
Right.
food fear, that creates a whole nother level. And we wonder why, hey, why can't I get my gut to heal? Because you're chronically stressed over what you can't eat, which is upregulating your sympathetic nervous system, your limbic system, and downregulating digestion and leading to more permeability. The biggest thing that's probably the stressor is what goes on between the 6 inches of your ears and less of the food.
So as I was deepening my knowledge base and trying to go through the science with just a different viewpoint. I was
Mhm.
really trying to leave my preconceived notions about which foods were good and which foods were bad at the door. That's hard, right? It's really hard to sort of let go of those biases, but I made a valiant effort. And um, and as I was, but the first food actually that I worked to reintroduce was lentils. So I was reading all of these scientific studies showing just how amazing lentils are for the gut microbiome, and then zoom out and see, okay, well they reduce risk of type 2 diabetes and they reduce risk of cardiovascular disease. Like I can see these long-term health benefits of eating lentils, and I don't eat any legumes. I'm going to try lentils, and I recognized in like the personal journey that kind of went behind the scenes with the professional journey of really changing my approach to food was that not only had I a lot of food fear that I needed to face in order to diversify and expand my diet, but I had a learned eating disorder, right? I had that food fear had turned into orthorexia, and that was a really hard realization to sort of realize that the diet that I had credited for a lot of health improvements had some negative consequences as well. And so I think that is you can see that journey in like the influence of that in how I communicate about Nutrivore, because it is very much about facing our food fears. That doesn't mean that every food works for every person, right? There's always going to be like gluten and I are never going to be friends. Like we're not destined to cohabitate. Um, but but being able to sort of let go of those moral judgments of foods and instead look through the lens of nutritional value, long-term health benefits, and balance and moderation, right? So not every food needs to contribute to the mission of supplying our body with all the nutrients that it needs, right? If our overall diet does that, and we're not eating anything to excess, right? Like it's okay if like one of those foods is a donut. Do you know what I mean? Like if we're focusing on those additions of nutritionally important foods. And so you can see in my framing of focusing on the foods to add, understanding what nutrients do in the body, what foods contain what nutrients, and like the eating patterns that get us the full range of nutrients that our bodies need. You can see somebody who has had to work very, very hard to recover from food fear. And I think that it's sort of unfortunate. I don't think any of us thought about that as we were trying to understand diet, but it is a consequence, I think, that a lot of people are sort of facing where they have that chronic stress response with food because of concerns of like doing something wrong and having this one thing that's going to trigger some kind of, avalanche of, cascade of badness effect. When in reality, once we can identify our own individual intolerances, allergies, sensitivities, the whatever we have left, should be like should be at our disposal, right? Should be foods that we can choose from and embrace for not just the nutritional value, but the quality of life.
So foundationally, somebody's listening to this and said, okay, but what am I eating? If this is a diet, whatever you want, a foundational concept or theory or lifestyle, what am I eating? Like,
Yeah.
what is it? Because you say, hey, there's no good food, there's no bad food. I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. But what is somebody eating on a Nutrivore based diet?
So I think I have different like entry points for different types of people. I think right now we're talking to people who are probably already eating mostly whole foods, right? Like that would be my entry point for somebody who's like still getting most of their foods in a box or a can, right? I was like,
Right.
okay, we're going to work on swapping those out for more whole foods, developing some cooking skills, right? Cooking more meals at home and like having a different view when we're eating out so that even when we're eating out, we're getting more whole foods on our plate. Shifting from shifting towards more fruits and vegetables, right? So I recommend about half of our plate being fruits and vegetables, about a quarter of our plate being a starchy food, preferably a whole starchy food, and about a quarter of our plate being a protein food, again, preferably a whole protein food, prepared in healthy fats, seasoned as we enjoy, right? Like that sort of like rough template for meals. For somebody who's already eating a whole foods diet, that's fairly familiar. That doesn't feel like a big stretch. So the next place to focus on is what I call the Nutrivore Foundational Foods. So these are 12 food families. So we're making slightly more granular groups of foods compared to food groups. So it's a little bit more focused than I think most of us are used to thinking about foods. And we have daily serving targets for fruits and vegetables, weekly serving targets for everything else. And that's based on their nutrition profiles and their long-term health benefits. So that there's some vegetable families that make this list. So cruciferous vegetables, the cabbage family, leafy vegetables, root vegetables, mushrooms, and alliums, which is the onion family. There's some fruit families that make this list, berries and citrus fruits. And then there's nuts and seeds, pulse type legumes, and seafood. All of these families have something either like completely unique, right? Like the glucosinolates in cruciferous vegetables that we just don't find in any other plant family, let alone any other type of food, right? Or they have like nuts and seeds, right? They just have this like collection of fiber types that are really good for the gut microbiome, our best food sources of vitamin E, which 96% of people don't get enough of from their diets, and as our main fat soluble antioxidant, is incredibly important for supporting long-term health. And then a range of polyphenols that are also particularly good for the gut microbiome, right? So there's like like you can get all of those things from other foods. If you're allergic to nuts and seeds, you could get them from avocados and olives. But nuts and seeds kind of have this like it's already packaged and ready to go, and that's why, right? We see like a 25 to 35% reduction in long-term health risks from about an ounce of nuts and seeds per day. It's one of the highest magnitude of benefit foods to add to our diet on a regular basis. So we either have something unique, the long chain omega-3 fats in seafood, or we have just this like collection of nutrients that are harder to get if we don't eat that food, like the vitamin E, the particular sort of lignin type fiber types, and polyphenols that we find in nuts and seeds. So that's, those are the foods that expedite the process of meeting our nutritional needs and earn us the most wiggle room for the other foods that we're choosing to supply joy, that aren't contributing to the nutrition mission of meeting our nutritional needs. So that's the other thing. Like what do I eat on a Nutrivore diet? Okay, so mostly whole foods, a balance of fruits, vegetables, starchy foods, and protein foods. I'm going to focus on food families, so making sure I'm getting some cruciferous vegetables, leafy vegetables, root vegetables, some nuts and seeds, getting some seafood in the mix a couple times a week. And then I'm gonna choose some foods that are just there because I love them, or I'm going to cook those healthier foods with ingredients, right? My favorite sauce, my favorite salad dressing. I'm going to add ingredients to those foods that maybe I wouldn't have enjoyed them otherwise, but now I'm going to think they're really tasty. So the other sort of like ingredient in Nutrivore is joy. Like that to me is that's the 20%. So if I get 80% of my calories from whole and minimally processed foods, I don't even need that to meet my nutritional needs. I can do it with about half of my calories. So if I'm getting 80% of my calories from whole foods, like I am safely overshooting the mark of everything. I'm getting more than 100% daily value. I'm still probably not close to tolerable upper limits, and I am flooding my body with the nutrients that my body needs to heal and function optimally. And then that 20% is joy, right? The 20% is what can I add to this? What's the cookie that I'm going to have after dinner, so that I feel like these eating patterns are sustainable for me personally, right? I don't feel like I am deprived of my favorite food. I don't feel like I'm missing out on something. So the other 20% is whatever it is for me personally. That means that focusing on eating more broccoli and beets and salmon feels good and feels like something I can keep doing forever.
So if this is a whole food based diet primarily,
Mhm.
right? But you say there's no good food, no bad food.
Yeah.
Is that because of how it places in our head? Like, I think the general consensus from my standpoint is that the ultra processed foods that so many people are eating are not that great for us, right? Are you saying, hey, they aren't great for us, but let's not use the connotation of good or bad? That's too black and white, because that unhealthy food, relatively unhealthy food, may still provide us some joy, right? And therefore, let's not call it bad. Let's just, because it has a value, but it's not as nutritious. So let's make sure most of the time we're getting more nutritious food into our life. And that way we've got more room for the less nutritious foods. Is that
Yeah.
where you're going?
So yes, for sure. So what I would say, sort of high level, is any food can fit into a healthy diet. So, but that doesn't mean that any amount of any food can fit into a healthy diet, right? So I can craft a extremely nutrient dense diet that completely meets my nutritional needs, where I'm eating all of the foods that benefit long-term health, and still have a bag of Doritos and still be well within my energy requirements for the day. Like that's a pretty straightforward
Mm-hmm.
challenge to put together. Like that math's pretty easy to do. But if I was eating 10 bags of Doritos, that's going to start to displace. That's going to start meaning I don't have room for all of those nutritionally important foods. Or that's going to mean that if I'm trying to do both, now my energy intake is too high, and that's going to be inflammatory and be a health risk in itself, right? So, so just because any food can fit into a healthy diet, that doesn't mean that every food can be eaten in whatever amount we want, and that still be a healthy eating pattern.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So, but yeah, go ahead.
I kind of explain to my clients, like, hey, let's think, what's your dietary habit versus a behavior, right? Like my
Yeah.
habit is I eat this way 80% of the time. And I have a behavior of potentially of periodically having something that's less healthy. Maybe it's a cocktail. Maybe it's something that's made with dark chocolate, right? But that's not the mainstay of what I do Monday through Sunday, right? You know,
Right.
right. So I think habits versus behavior. Somebody says, I have a good eating, I eat healthy. Okay, let's take a look at 3 days and see what it is, right? You have a behavior of eating healthier foods periodically, but you have a habit of eating less healthy foods on a regular basis. So we just need to, we want to swap that, right? So I think that's kind of what you're saying is like, hey, let's make sure that we're getting the most of the stuff in most of the time. And then you have room for the drink.
Well, and I would say
room for the cake or the dessert.
Because you have room for that slice of cake, that bag of Doritos, that whatever it is, right? Whatever your quality of life food is, because we can create a healthy diet that has room for that, we shouldn't think of that as a cheat food or a junk food or a guilty pleasure, right? Like we don't need to think of that food with all of these like moralization terms that basically mean it's a bad food. When we do that, we think of ourselves as that same moral judgment when we eat that food, right? So if I think about that as a junk food, well, then I'm a junk person for eating that junk food, right? I'm a bad person for eating that bad food. And it makes us feel like I shouldn't, right? My diet would be better without it. But if that food is your tool for sustainability, then that statement's not true. If eating that bag of Doritos is what means that all of those healthy eating habits are sustainable, then that food is not a bad food. That food is a necessary tool for the sustainability of your overall higher quality diet. And so from that perspective, if we can like ditch the moral judgments of foods and instead think about the nutritional value, what are the foods that form the foundation of my diet versus the foods that are there for quality of life, right? That don't necessarily contribute to our nutritional mission of meeting our nutritional needs from the foods we eat, then we can understand the relative proportions. And by focusing on the foods to add, right? Like how I'm going to add these root vegetables, these leafy greens, these mushrooms, right? I'm going to add some citrus fruit, some legumes. Focusing on the foods to add also means that we are filling up on the nutritionally important foods, and that helps to like automatically moderate our intake of the foods that we don't want to eat in excess, right? The foods that are going to be health neutral in moderation, right? So like ultra processed foods are health neutral up to about 20% of our calories from ultra processed foods. And then above 20% of our calories from ultra processed foods, that's where we start to see health risks go up. So those are the foods that we do want to moderate, right? But that doesn't mean that we need to think of them as bad. I prefer changing the language around that and thinking of them as tools for consistency.
Yeah. Well, I mean, essentially, we love doing that, right? We're very black or white, Republican or Democrat, right? It's either good cholesterol or bad cholesterol, and none of that's really true. And so for somebody who's listening to this, they're like, okay, but how do I know what I need, right? Especially in nutrition world, we talk about there's arguments over, do calories matter? Do macros matter? Right?
Yes.
You don't need to check your macros, don't matter, right? It's about calories. Other people say it's about calories and not macros. It's probably all of it matters to some degree, but the issue for the person who's like trying to live this is, all right, wait a minute. What am I trying to accomplish? And what do I use as the standard, right? Am I looking at calories? Am I looking at macro? Like, what should I be following? So what's the tool? Like, what's different maybe in the Nutrivore diet that's going to help somebody understand what their actual nutritional needs are? And how do we do that? Especially because I know in that you talk about nutritional density and quality, and that's a tricky conversation too, because
Oh, yeah.
it the food that's grown on some massive agricultural farm versus what's grown in my garden in my backyard that I know what's in the soil. I put the minerals back in there, right? The nutritional quality is different. So is there a tool within the Nutrivore ecosphere that helps somebody understand what they need to be consuming, whether it's calories, macros, and nutrients? And how do we verify? How does somebody know that the food they're eating has the nutrient density that we think it does?
Yeah. Okay, so there's like three parts to this question. So I want to start like high level
Sorry
and then
about
we'll
that.
like zoom in. No, this is I really love this question. So high level, one of the challenges with the calories macro conversation is it's always an attempt to distill a healthy diet down to one thing. And we are biologically complex. We can't actually track just one thing and think that that is going to automatically make a diet a healthy diet. There's 49 essential nutrients. There's hundreds of other nutrients that are important, even if they're not technically essential. But the more of them we consume, the better our long-term health outcomes. That doesn't mean that eating a healthy diet has to be complicated, right? It doesn't mean that we need to track hundreds of different things.
Mm-hmm.
There's some pretty simple eating patterns that will get us all of those nutrients. But it does mean we want to think sort of beyond one thing. That being said, one of the tools that I've created is a nutrient density calculation called the Nutrivore score, which measures the nutrient density of food. And the reason why I want to tie those two ideas together is the Nutrivore score is a fascinating way to look at food. It is, I think, a really valuable data point, but I don't want to distill Nutrivore down to just one thing either, right? I don't want to make us only look at this nutrient density calculation as the only thing that we're using to choose food. I think it's best used in combination with especially one other piece of information, which is the food family that food belongs to. The food family will give us the pattern, right? It'll give us the types of nutrients that that food contains. Whereas the nutrient density score, the Nutrivore score, is a measurement of total nutrients per calorie. So it already is more than one thing because 33 nutrients go into the calculation. So it is a measurement of the total of those 33 nutrients divided by the energy density of the food. And it's a great way to see the nutritional value of foods, right? So to see what am I getting from a carrot or iceberg lettuce or a liver or kale, right? Or a potato or white sugar, right? Like we can see what is the nutritional value. It gives us this very clear, this food is giving me a lot of nutrients for the energy contribution that it's making to my diet, or this food is giving me a lot of energy for the nutrient contribution that it's giving to my diet. So it's a really great way to sort of identify foundational foods, right? Foods that are giving lots of nutrients for the amount of energy that they contribute versus foods that I might want to eat more in moderation because they give a lot more energy than they do nutrients. So it's a fascinating lens. And I think it's particularly valuable for people who are working to address food fears and are looking for a deeper understanding of foods that they've maybe been avoiding and now want to try to add back into their diets. If you can see a really high Nutrivore score for this food, it gives you that little piece of like, okay, I know I've been afraid of this food, but here's this like reassuring piece of information that tells me, aha, here's the nutrients per calorie I'm going to get from this food. This is a nutritionally valuable food. The third part of your question, though, was how do I know the nutritional difference between the carrot grown in some, giant scale farm where maybe their soil quality isn't that great versus the heirloom variety that's growing in my backyard right now?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a trickier question because the factors that go into the actual, actually, back up. There's actually a huge amount of variability in the nutrient content of the same crop in different growing conditions.
Hmm.
So it's not just the soil quality, but it is the climate, it's the luck of the weather, it's the season it's grown in, whether fertilizers are used, what types of fertilizers are used, right? It's the amount of rainfall. It's like it's a huge, complicated calculation, and we don't really have reliable, or we don't at all have reliable nutrition data for, let's say, carrots grown in more clay soil, more sandy soil, more loamy soil, with compost added, with manure added, with synthetic fertilizers added, grown in the winter versus the spring, right? Like grown in zone 7B versus zone 3A, right? We don't actually have that type of like, I mean, that the table would be, I mean, I would love that. I mean, I'm already, I'm like, oh my gosh, that would be amazing to have that kind of data to be able to like zoom in and go, okay, here's how to grow the most nutrient dense carrots, right? We're
Hmm.
going to do compost and we're going to have this much rainfall and it's going to be this zone and it's going to be this time of year, right? Like different varieties of carrots almost certainly have some nutritional differences, right? Okay, well, it'll be these three varieties are the most nutrient dense. Like that would be a nutrition data nerds like just the dream scenario to have all that data. We don't. What we have is averages. So we
Hmm.
have average carotenoid content, vitamin C content, vitamin K content, all, B vitamins, minerals. We have average taken from grocery store carrots from, a few hundred to a few thousand different locations. And we have their average nutrition data for the average quality, mass produced, factory farmed carrot. I do not have data for my backyard carrots at all.
Yeah.
But there's actually something really, I think, reassuring in those averages, which is even though if you get your carrots at the farmer's market or you grow them yourself, you are almost certainly getting a more nutrient dense carrot. The average of the regular old carrots you're going to get in the grocery store still has so much nutritional value. I mean, the Nutrivore score is 889, I think, for carrots. That is an incredibly high nutrient density for carrots for our average, our baseline carrots. And so when we use that data, right? So we're using the average of the most basic version of it, of all of these different foods, we see that it's still really easy to meet our nutritional needs with these foods, that it's still, those nutrient values still add up, right? That carrot's still going to give us 9% of the daily value of potassium, the hardest nutrient to get from our diets, right? That is still going to be a major nutrient contributor. And I can feel if that's all I have access to, right? If that's what I can afford, I can feel good about that choice. If I can like up it, right? If I can go get carrots at the farmer's market, if I can grow them myself, right? If I can get them from a local farm where I know they do a ton of different soil amendments and they, just have the like tastiest carrots ever, then I can feel good that that's going to be higher than the baseline, right? That's going to be higher than the one that I would have gotten at the store. I can't say how much. Is it 5% higher? Is it 20% higher? Is it 100% higher? I cannot say without the numbers to crunch the numbers. But I can feel if that's something that I have access to, and I actually do have a big vegetable garden and I have carrots growing in my vegetable garden. I think they're so much tastier when they're fresh out of the garden than they are from the grocery store. I can feel good about that because I know it's going to be higher, but I also know the baseline, the average of of that food was already really high.
Okay. And I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I got to imagine that there's some pushback from our community to some degree, maybe not, but especially the functional medicine and integrative community, we're very much like, if it's nutrient dense, that is why we're pushing multivitamins and green drinks and all these processed supplementation. So somebody might be listening to it. It's about nutrients. That's why I get this powdered green drink, and I drink that every day because it's got 100% of my daily nutrient needs. do we need a Nutrivore diet? Why can't I just get it all as a supplement? Do you see
Well,
something significantly different between relying on the nutrition from a pre-processed green drink or caps or a one a day or six a day multivitamin versus what you get from food? Because some people may say, but food has got toxins, the food's got pesticides, the food's got all this stuff. This green drink is organic and it has all my nutrients for the day. Where do you stand on that?
this is again, it's sort of like a multifactorial question. Let's talk about multivitamins first, because this has the
Mm-hmm.
biggest body of scientific literature. Um, so interestingly, we don't see a health signal from multivitamins, at least not for the big things, right? Not all-cause mortality or cardiovascular disease incidence or mortality or cancer incidence or mortality. That doesn't mean there's not a time and a place for a multivitamin. That doesn't mean it's not good for like age-related cognitive decline. B vitamins definitely seem to be helpful for that. That doesn't mean there's not like more specific uses for multivitamin. But if the nutrients in a multivitamin were used the same way they were from food, we would expect to see the health effect. And in fact, there was a really big 2019 study where they compared the nutrients from food versus the nutrients from supplement and had a fairly lengthy list of these nutrients when we get them from food improve health, and when we get them from supplements, from a multivitamin specifically, they don't. There's not a super great answer right now in the scientific literature for why, which I think is a pretty natural, like, well, why don't they? It could be they're not digested as effectively. That's certainly true for tablets. We know tablets just take way too long to dissolve in the digestive tract. That it's probably missing the chance. It's probably getting fully dissolved past the various receptors for absorption. Maybe that's not as true for capsules. It might just be that we tend to take them on an empty stomach, and so our digestive processes are not as efficient as when we're taking them with food. It could be that they're not meeting enough of the average nutrient shortfalls, so they're still not bringing us up high enough for a lot of the nutrients to make a big enough difference. It could be that they're missing, right? Like we don't have fibers, are not a common ingredient, right? In a multivitamin, we don't have the full range of polyphenols, right? In a multivitamin, it could be that it just doesn't have everything that we need. And so our diets are still falling short. But what we do see in the scientific literature is when people eat whole foods and they eat more fruits and vegetables and legumes and seafood and nuts and seeds, that improves cardiovascular disease incidence, mortality, cancer incidence, mortality, and all-cause mortality, along with a lot of the other less prevalent outcomes like Alzheimer's disease, osteoporosis, osteoarthritis, chronic kidney disease, right, age-related cognitive decline, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a large body of scientific literature showing multivitamins don't do what we think they should. Does that mean that the really carefully crafted multivitamin, like that's again, it's an average, right? So does that mean that's all multivitamins? We don't know. We don't like most of the, if you think about the multivitamins that are really popular in our community, we don't have clinical trials on those, right? Clinical trials are crazy expensive to run, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
not reasonable. They're not required for approval to sell those multivitamins. Like why would you? But we don't have a scientific study to say, okay, but this one's good and this one isn't. And until we have that scientific study, what I can say is food is good.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like a multivitamin is hurting anything unless someone's getting too much calcium, right? That's like a separate situation. But if you are talking to a person who can choose between the multivitamin or putting that money towards the grocery budget, I can say the science says you're going to get the benefit if you put that money towards your grocery budget.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think there's something to it's like this chicken soup analogy, right? When chicken noodle soup, home moms or grandmom's homemade chicken noodle soup had healing capacity. So they broke it all down and wanted to find out what was the ingredient that actually did all the healing. And when they broke it all down, they said none of these individual things really help. So there's likely things in whole food that when we eat whole food has a synergistic effect. And maybe there's an ingredient that we don't even know yet. Like we find this out
Right.
all the time in the body. Like, oh, we think we've got metabolism filled out and hormones figured out. And then all of a sudden we go,
No, we're still
here's this thing we never knew
identifying new
before, right?
pathways. We're still identifying new vitamin-like compounds. Like PQQ was discovered in 92. Like, I mean, we've got a whole range of nutritive compounds that we don't understand hardly at all. And but we do know that the foods that contain those nutritive compounds benefit our health.
And it's possible that we don't know how the things we make in the lab and put together in a capsule or tablet, how they play together. Just like
Right.
from a probiotic standpoint, we can have people putting a whole bunch of different probiotic strains in a capsule and give it to you and say, hey, this has got all the stuff that the literature says. But what we don't realize is, yeah, but those probiotics don't work. They don't play well together when you put them together, right? So there's a lot of complexity to it. So Sarah, I want to be respectful of your time, and we're kind of bumping up against it. And I want to give you a chance to kind of talk about a little bit more about the Nutrivore, your website, the book, and the score. So where can people go to learn more about the Nutrivore diet and learn more about what you're talking about today?
So my home base is Nutrivore.com. So that is where I am building the knowledge base to inform our choices so that we can choose more nutrient-dense foods and understand those eating patterns that are compatible with whatever other constraints or preferences we have with food that will help us meet our nutritional needs from the foods we eat. So Nutrivore.com is where you can learn all the different ways that nutrients improve our health. You can learn about the foods that contain them and all the different nutrients that different foods have, and those like big picture eating patterns. In terms of like really digging into the details of the prevalence of nutrient deficiencies, the most important foods, and then tools to like really implement. All of that is in my book. So Nutrivore, The Radical New Science for Getting the Nutrients You Need from the Foods You Eat, available wherever books are sold. And that is everything that you need, including lots of amusing historical anecdotes, which were very fun to track down and include in the book. And then I'm on, let's see now, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, and Pinterest as at Dr. Sarah Ballantyne. And I share different content on all those platforms. So wherever you like to hang out online, come follow me.
So, Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, thank you so much for coming on the Thyroid Answers podcast. Pick up a copy of her book. Go to her website, check it out. There's lots of interesting information there. And maybe at some point we can get her back on and finish the conversation, because I think we really just kind of scratched the surface. But I am very in line with where you're headed with this new project, shall we say? Like this is more in line with where I try and get people in general. So now having maybe a nice name for what we all might call, maybe that makes it even easier, because people always say, like, what should I be like a whole food based diet is primarily where you want to spend 80% of your time. So now if that's where we are with a Nutrivore based diet, now we've got a set of guidelines that can help somebody through that process. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast. For the listeners, make sure you listen to this and share it with friends and family. Thank you.
Thanks again.